Welcome to episode 2 of the thehodgypodgypod podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Strati, and I'm so excited to welcome you to our very first Menagerie Monday. If you're wondering what the heck Menagerie Monday is, I'm going to tell you. It is where we talk about all the things. We talk about good times, the good old days. We talk about weird stories, fun stories, crazy stories. We talk about Mandela Effects. If you don't know what those are, you're going to learn. It's going to blow your mind. We talk about all the things. And this is where I want your week to start off right. I want it to start off on a positive note. It's Monday. We're going back to work. We're going back to school, sports, everything's starting up. And I just want this to be where you can kind of maybe escape a little bit from all of the craziness of your lives and think about all the fun times of the 80s and 90s, 2000s, all of those good old days. And you can think about those and start off on a positive note in your week, a good vibe, high vibe, however you want to put it. And you can think about the crazy stories that I've told that day, the weird stories, the Mandela Effect that just blew your mind that you had no idea had changed, but it did. This is, like I said in my first episode, I want this to be where it's like we're just friends hanging out, having a conversation, having a great time, or I'm leaving you that long voicemail and you're getting back to me through an email or a DM. And it's just a way for us to have a good time together and take the pressure off of us from all the chaos of our lives, all the heaviness of the world. And we just enjoy this 20 to 30 minutes of time, and we can just take that with us throughout the rest of the week and just have a good freaking week. So this episode, I'm going to be talking about why we seem to just love the 80s and 90s and 2000s so much, and why we seem to be really drawn to that time. And you're also going to learn a little bit more about me today. You're going to learn a lot about me throughout this whole podcast. Thursdays are really where that's going to go a little bit more serious and a little deeper. And Mondays are more just trying to have a good time and just not taking things so seriously. So we are also going to I'm going to introduce you guys to some Mandela Effects. If you don't know what those are, I will explain those to you. And those are pretty wild. And eventually we will be doing specific episodes on, I have 1,000 different ideas rolling around on this head of mine. So we will be doing themed episodes like 80s horror movies, 90s horror movies when we get closer to Halloween, Christmas stuff, talking about how Christmas was different back in the 80s and 90s compared to now. We'll be doing all sorts of different themed episodes based off of the years. And I think that we're all just gonna, when we talk about it, you're just going to be like, man, I remember that. Or memories are going to be unlocked in your brain. And it's just going to be so much fun to talk about with you guys. So to get to know me a little bit more, I am a child of the 80s and the 90s and a little bit of the 2000s. I was born in 1985. I do remember good chunks of things happening in my first 5 years of life, more so than other people I've talked to. They're like, I don't know, I was a baby. Like, well, I remember things when I was a baby or when I was 3 or 4. Like, that's just how my brain works. Like, I remember weird things, like the smell of baby wipes at my daycare when I was 2 or 3. So if I ever smell that smell again, I'm like back in that daycare. I remember certain shows. I remember certain foods during those times that we don't have anymore. And I think that I like thinking about those things because those were really good memories, and that like my father-in-law said, he thinks that the reason why we have been hyper focused on the 80s and the 90s is because every generation does that. We think about the positives of growing up. Like that's just what our default setting does in our brain. We try and think about the good things, not the bad things, which I agree with, because to a certain extent, when we think about those times and we think about those shows, the movies, the foods, all of the clothes, we're like, man, those were awesome. And we don't think about all of the other stuff that went along with all of that wasn't so positive. And it's nostalgia, right? Like every generation does it. Every generation thinks back to the time that they grew up and think, man, that was a good time. That was a simple time. But I think that is true. We do miss the simplicity of life back then. Things are a little bit more, they're easier and more challenging at the same time. We are dealing with social media, which we thank the Lord did not have during my childhood and my high school years. That adds a whole another element to life. It's good and it's bad, but I think that for some of us who had not the best high school and junior high experiences, etc., I think that not having social media back then was a godsend, because that would have been terrible. But yes, life is made easier by having all this technology and all of these things that we've learned, etc. But there's also, you have to be careful with everything you say now. Everything in the 80s and 90s, if you go back and even watch a cartoon, you watch a Bugs Bunny, and you watch him in a war against what he calls Injuns. You can't say stuff like that now. And you didn't have to worry so much about being politically correct back then. And you didn't have to worry about offending people. And in fact, if you offended somebody, they offended you right back, and it was hilarious, and everybody laughed, and it was just a good time, because you knew that people weren't saying something to you to hurt you. They were just being funny. And whether it was in a show, in person, on a cartoon, it was just, nobody took it to heart like the person was trying to destroy you. And you wouldn't be destroyed by saying something offensive to them. It was just the way that it was. And I think that people miss that. There's an added anxiety to the world now that wasn't there before. And like, even with one of the things that everybody has said that I've asked, being able to just ride around on your bike at night, and like till the street lights turn on, I would ride around my court for hours just by myself. I was a 9-year-old girl, just by myself. I would go wherever I kind of wanted to go, and my mom was just inside watching football, whatever. Normally didn't come out to check on me. I would just be doing that. And that's what all these other people that I've talked to, that's what they loved to do. They would play with neighborhood friends. They didn't have to check in with anybody. Like when the streetlights came on, they came inside. It was just, now there's so many other things that we have to worry about with our own children. And I know that, especially as parents, we wish that safety for our kids that we felt back then, that maybe it was ignorance because there wasn't social media and we weren't nose deep in the news, like hearing all of these different things about this kidnapping or this whatever. We didn't have all of that in our face. So maybe, I'm sure all of those things were happening, but we were in our own little bubble, and we as parents miss being able to have that, and especially for our children to be able to have that. And it's just, when you think about those times, things just, in a sense, did seem easier. Plus, for people like me that grew up in the 80s and 90s, we did have less responsibility. So, of course, it is going to seem more fun and we have more longing for it because we're adults now. We're adults with jobs, with all these things to do, with children, with sports to go to, with all of these different things that we have to juggle. And we didn't have to do any of that back in the 80s and 90s. So obviously that is something that could be said for any decade, right? For anybody growing up, like, yeah, I loved the 70s so much more simple back then, or the 50s or whatever, because you were kids. You didn't have the responsibilities that you have now. But also at the same time, when you think about the 80s and the 90s, especially like those two decades, things were just amazing. You think about just like my favorite movie, Back to the Future. That's Marty's jacket. And we've got Doc Brown's jacket. We think about those movies were amazing. Special effects have gotten better. Yes, that's fine. But like Back to the Future is my favorite movie of all times. Like I absolutely love that movie. You have TV shows cartoons especially, that were not politically correct. Garfield, Scooby-Doo, Looney Tunes. You had you had Who's the Boss? You had Murder, She Wrote. You had Nickelodeon, Home Improvement, all these different shows and networks that had just amazing shows that you could just sit your little butt down and watch. And like, I have my kids watch these shows because I know that watch these movies because I know what's in them, and I know that they're safe, and I don't have to explain something to them that I don't want to have to explain to them yet. Like, I want them to stay in their innocence for as long as possible. And you can do that with these 80s and 90s shows and movies. And I just absolutely love that. I think that a lot of people love and miss those times. You have to kind of nowadays, if you are wanting to take your child to see a movie, like for me, I either ask somebody who's seen it, or I go onto Facebook and see if anybody's talked about it, or I read reviews and see like, okay, is this movie going to be good for us to see? Is there going to be something that I have to explain to them that I don't quite want to explain to them yet? And you don't have to do that with the 80s and 90s. Like, there was swear words, okay? There were different things like that, but that's not a big deal. That's easy to talk about with kids. So I just think that those times were just so much fun to go back and relive. And those movies, I asked my friends and family what were their favorite parts of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and we all listed the same stuff. It was the TV shows, it was the movies, it was Blockbuster, it was, which, back then it would give us such anxiety to go, because if we didn't have the movie there, if it wasn't there and you saw the box, but the box was empty, or worse, it had like the wrong thing in it, it was so stressful and like devastating for us for that weekend. But now thinking about it, like, oh my gosh, that was just the best. And it's just, we love thinking about those times, and it's just so funny how everybody has just similar answers to the question I asked. When I asked about the 90s, we all were thinking the same thing, TGIF or SNICK for like Nick at Night, all of Nickelodeon or ABC. Those, we all remember TGIF, sitting there Friday nights watching Step by Step, Family Matters, Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Boy Meets World, all of those different shows with good life lessons where you show the nuclear family where they were together, or it just had good lessons that you could relate to no matter who you were. And you also had the crazy action movies, Die Hard, any Nick Cage movie, Independence Day. There was so many, just everything was just so cool. And even though we have way better CGI now and stuff, it's like, you know that it's CGI, you know it's not real. Like there's kind of like magic that's taken out of it now, because you're like, oh, that's fake. Before, it was like, whoa, seeing Bruce Willis slamming into a building or seeing Hans Gruber fall out of the building, it was just like, oh my gosh, that looks so real. That's not a green screen, or that's not CGI. He's not some fake like robot dude falling down the building. That's him. Like, he fell for like 40 feet. That was his last scene in the movie. So he's like, oh, well, at least it's my last scene, so if I do die in real life, they've got it. So everything seemed to be more real back then. And I think that's something that we really miss, because with social media and everything, we have more connection to each other, but a disconnect as well, because it's through phones, it's through computers. It's not like you're talking to somebody, but it's just not the same. We have the ability to connect more, but I feel like it's more hollow than it used to be. And I think that when we think about the 80s and 90s, there was no disconnect. There was more togetherness than there is now. And there's such a divide in the world now. And I think the good thing, then that's another reason why people love the 80s and 90s, because that's something that they can all talk about. And like I said, like when you talk about the 80s and 90s and 2000s, we all talk about the same things. Like, wow, I absolutely loved those movies and those foods that they used to have. Do you remember this? Like, oh my gosh, I used to love Snackwells. They were probably actually disgusting, but I loved them. And now they're gone. I wish that they were still here. They're like, oh, that show. Or do you remember wearing the swishy pants and going shoo, 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 shoo? And do you remember the crazy hair? Oh my gosh, you should see this picture of me with my bangs hard as a rock because all the hairspray I sprayed on them. There was just, people are being brought together by the past, which is what I am trying to do through this show. And I know this seems a little rambly and all over the place. It's my second episode. Give me a break here. But I think that the reason why I wanted to do this podcast was because with social media, there's so much stuff everywhere, and things get lost in the shuffle of everything else, and you kind of become numb as you scroll along to, like, it just becomes a habit for you. Like, my husband was talking just last night. We were watching a movie, but he picked up his phone and like just started scrolling on Facebook, and he's like, wait, I'm watching a movie. And he probably couldn't even remember anything that he saw on Facebook, because it's just like a thing. It's just become a habit, and we just are so separate by these social medias and by all of this stuff that I think people cling to stuff like the 80s and 90s because they long for that feeling of belonging. They long for that familiarity. They know what those times were like. They remember them. They feel, no matter what happened in your past or childhood, whatever childhood trauma or whatever you grew up with, there was a safety in those times where there's not safety in the times we have now. There's chaos in what we have going on now. And the focus on the 80s and the 90s is like those were good times that we can all relate to. And maybe that's why these stores are bringing back stuff like that, to try and connect the newer generations with the older ones and try not to have such a big separation between the two anymore, because there is a big gap when you think about the way that kids are now to where we're different kids. The kids that we were back then, definitely not the same batch that are now becoming adults these days. So, but when you talk about those decades, you can bring together people like, oh, I used to wear those swishy pants or that flower shirt or denim everything. And that's a way for us to talk to that newer generation. And I think that that is important. And I know that every generation thinks back on the times that they had and like remembers the good old days. But I think the 80s, 90s, and 2000s just have a special place in history and in time that just is a connection for everybody and brings them all together. And I think that I am going to continue to talk about those times. I'm going to continue to focus on those because they were amazing to think about. And it's just, I like that with so much division, and I'm not talking about politics, I'm not going to do it, but you do know there's so much division with the world and who, on what side you're on and whatever you decide to be called and all of these things. But if you bring up something from the 80s or 90s, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, who have like been around forever and they continue to change them, or all of these different things, Saturday morning cartoons and music, like Eminem is still around, and how great Michael Jackson's music was, and Madonna, and all these things, like we can still appreciate those things now, and so can others in other generations now, and younger kids can appreciate those things. And so I will continue to focus on those things because I don't want to be separate from everybody else. I don't want to be divided. I think that makes all of us as a whole weaker. And if what brings us together and brings us all on the same page is talking about the 80s and the 90s and all of the different things that happened in those times, then I'm all for it. And so I cannot wait to continue to talk more about these things, more specifically about different like TV shows. We'll go into a whole episode about that, like I said, or movies, and we'll dive deeper into all of those things. And just really, I want to hear from you guys what you think about, like, what is your reasoning for wanting and loving the 80s and 90s so much? Why do you think that that is such a big focus, and why has it come back so strongly? And I want you to tell me what your favorite shows, movies, foods, all these different things are. Because there are things like, there are foods and stuff that are gone now, that like Rice Krispie treat cereal. Oh my God, that were so good. Those are gone now. Like, what food, what thing did you have back then that is no more, that you're like, that was the shit, I loved it? I want you to send me that stuff and let me know, and we'll talk about it, and we will just be like, that was so good. And we can forget about the crazy shit that's going on in the world, all the divisiveness. We can forget about all of that and just focus on this. And it's like, we will live in our little nostalgia bubble together for 20 to 35 minutes a day on this podcast. So with that, I am going to wrap it up a little bit. We are going to, I'm not quite sure what the next Menagerie Monday is going to be, but it's probably going to be something 80s and 90s. So for Thursday, this coming Thursday, we're going to be doing our therapy Thursdays. This is the more serious day. We get a little deeper. We talk about all of the stuff that we've had going on in our lives, the childhood trauma, depression, stress, anxiety, that stuff that we kind of have been taught to push down a little bit, and especially for people in my age and older, you just gotta suck it up and just deal with it. But we talk about that on Thursdays. We talk about how much stress affects our lives, how much social media affects our lives, more in more detail, positives and negatives about that. And I just want to have that be where you can unload all your stuff to me and we talk about it and you get it off your chest, and I get stuff off my chest. I tell you what I've learned in my life that has helped me grow and continue to grow. And we go deep. It's gonna get serious. There's gonna be, it's not gonna necessarily be super comfortable, but if it's feeling uncomfortable for you, that just means that you need to watch and you need to listen, because there's something in you that's like, okay, this is like new for me. This is unknown, like dealing with this stuff. So sit with it, listen to me, talk through it with you. And I think Thursdays are going to be really good. And Mondays are just going to be fun and wild, and we're just going to have a great time. And we will end every Monday with a few Mandela Effects. So Mandela Effects, if you don't know what those are, it's basically when the term came from Nelson Mandela, people thinking that he died in the 80s, but he didn't die until like decades later. And people were like, I remember the funeral, I remember this, I remember that, but it never happened. And so that's what the Mandela Effect is about. It's about different things happening, or spellings of certain things being different. And I'm going to give you examples of that each week. And then you guys will let me know, like, oh my God, how is that not, wait, that it wasn't always like that? No, it was never like that. So for example, I'm going to give you today the Berenstain Bears. So if you remember that book growing up as kids, it was the mom and the dad, and then the sister and the brother bear. And I always used to watch, we used to go into a different classroom in elementary school and watch the videos. Like there was a cartoon of it. And so with my memory, I had the word burned into my brain, Berenstain Bears, where it ended with Stein. But it has apparently always been Stain, Berenstain Bears, Stain. You cannot tell me, no matter what, that's what it has always been. Steen. Not Stain. It was Berenstain Bears. So that is one example of how things where thousands of people think that that's the way it was. And people will just say, oh, you're just remembering wrong. No, we're not. Something, we don't know what causes it. We don't know what made the change, but something is different. And I love, they make me crazy and sometimes a little angry, but it just means there's so much more to this world than we realize. There's so much, it's not just black and white. There's so many other layers to this world and universe, and it is freaking fascinating and a little scary, but it's like, why not believe in something more than just the black and white of the world. Like there's so many more layers to it, and that is just amazing. And that means that you have so much more potential in you than you realize. If something like the Berenstain Bears can change, like something that I know for sure existed, then what else can be changed that people say can't be? There's so many different examples of the Mandela effect. There's like another one growing up, Fruit of the Loom. I remember there being a cornucopia. That is the only reason I knew how to draw a freaking cornucopia in school, was from the Fruit of the Loom little brand thing. But it never existed, ever. And they made a joke of it, and they had it come out like years later, like, oh, here's our cornucopia. But it never actually happened. They never had it. But why do I remember it? Why do thousands of other people remember it and say the same thing? That was the only reason I knew what a cornucopia was. Like, people would say that's the only reason, because of that Fruit of the Loom thing. So, or the Monopoly guy having a monocle. Things like that. People said, oh, you're just getting him confused with Mr. Peanut. I don't think I can confuse a man with Peanut. Like, I don't care if I'm 3 or 39. I know the difference between a man and a peanut. Like, I'm not going to mix those two up. So, and even if you watch the movie Ace Ventura, When Nature Calls, you see Jim, we're going to get into a whole thing, and this is where I get scattered, and that's why I have my notes. But Jim Carrey does a whole bunch of different lines from movies in his movies that are Mandela effects. And this happens to be one of them. In When Nature Calls, when there's a gentleman coming down the stairs that looks like he's got a monocle and he's got the little tuxedo, and Ace says, look, it's the Monopoly guy. He's got the monocle and he looks like the flippin' Monopoly guy. But the monocle never existed. In this world, or whatever you want to call it, never had the monocle. And I sure as shit know it wasn't because I saw Mr. Peanut and then I saw the Monopoly guy. I'm like, they're the same. That's why. No. So things like that, stories like that, you're going to hear a lot more of. And I just can't wait to continue talking to you guys about all of these things. And I look forward to your feedback. I'll have all the links to connect with me in the show notes. And I look forward to seeing you on Thursday. So thanks for joining me.